The wind in the high columbines did not howl so much as it shrieked, a thin, tearing sound that stripped the warmth from the air before the sun had even cleared the eastern peaks. It was late autumn in the Wyoming Territory, the time of year when the sky turned the color of bruised iron and the ground froze hard enough to ring under a boot heel. Mara Vance stood on the porch of her cabin, a heavy woolen shawl pulled tight around her shoulders, listening to the morning. She did not look at the view, though it was spectacular, a sweeping valley of pine and granite that dropped away into the blue distance. She was listening for things that did not belong, the snap of a dry branch under a heavy foot, the chuff of a horse, the silence of a jay that should have been scolding. There was only the wind. Mara turned and went back inside, bolting the heavy oak door behind her. She was 32 years old, though the lines around her eyes and the set of her mouth made her look older. She wore black, not because it was fashionable, but because it was a shield. The morning dress was made of sturdy bombazine, faded now to the color of charcoal, patched neatly at the elbows. It told the world she was a widow, a creature of grief and bad luck, and that was a useful thing to be. It made people look away, inside. The cabin was a fortress of small comforts. A cast-iron stove hummed with heat, smelling of pine pitch and coffee. Bundles of drying sage and rabbit tobacco hung from the rafters. The floor was swept clean. The wood scrubbed so often it was pale and smooth as bone. It was a tidy life, a quiet life, and it was the only one she had left. She poured a cup of coffee, black and bitter, and sat at the rough-hewn table. Her eyes drifted to the trunk at the foot of her bed. It was bound in brass and locked with a heavy padlock. In the daylight, she never touched it. It was just a piece of furniture, a place to stack quilts. But at night, sometimes, when the wolves were singing in the canyon and the memories were too loud to ignore, she would check the lock, just to be sure. She touched her left shoulder absent-mindedly. Beneath the high collar of her dress, a ridge of scar tissue ran from her collarbone to her shoulder blade. It was an old wound, healed silver, but in the cold weather, it ached with a dull, thrumming persistence. It was a reminder that before she was Mara Vance, the widow who sold skunk pelts and bought flour in silence, she had been someone else. The town of Clearwater lay 12 miles down the mountain, a muddy scar of civilization that Mara visited only when starvation threatened. She hated the place. She hated the way the air in the general store seemed to thicken when she walked in. 2 days ago, she had made the trip. The bell above the door had jingled, cheerful and oblivious, and the conversation around the potbelly stove had died instantly. Mr. Henderson, the grocer, had wiped his hands on his apron, his smile tight and failing to reach his eyes. "Morning, Mrs. Vance," he had said. "Cold coming down early this year. Flour and lamp oil, please," Mara had said. Her voice was low, rusty from disuse. "And a box of 44 cartridges." The men around the stove had shifted. One of them, a man she didn't know, had leaned forward, chewing on a matchstick. "44, the stranger had said. "Expecting trouble, ma'am?" Mara had not looked at him. She had kept her eyes on the counter, watching Mr. Henderson weigh the flour. "Wolves," she had said. "Big wolves." The stranger had chuckled, as she had left, dragging her supplies to the mule tied outside. She had heard the whispers start up again. They were not quiet enough. They never were. "That is her," a voice had said. "The Black Widow. Husband died up there last winter," another voice had murmured. "Jacob Vance, fine man. They say he found a vein of gold thick as your arm before he fell down that ravine." "Fell," the first voice had scoffed. "If you believe that, I have a bridge to sell you. Men do not just fall when they are sitting on a fortune, and she is the only one who knows where the map is. She looks like she would sooner shoot you than look at you. She is hiding something. You can see it in the way she walks. Guilt weighs heavy." Mara had tightened the cinch on the mule, her hands steady, her face impassive. She had learned a long time ago that words were weapons, but silence was armor. Let them talk. Let them think she was a witch or a murderer or a miser hoarding a dead man's gold. Fear kept them off her porch. Fear kept her safe. Or so she had thought. 5 miles east of the cabin, in a temporary camp sheltered by a rock overhang, Silas Vane warmed his hands over a smokeless fire. He was a handsome man in a sharp, predatory way, with a mustache waxed to points and eyes the color of dirty ice. He wore a buffalo coat that looked expensive and stolen, and he cleaned his fingernails with a knife that had ended 3 arguments in the last month alone. "She is alone," Silas said, his voice smooth and conversational. "That is the long and short of it. A woman alone in the high country is an unnatural thing. Nature abhors a vacuum, and it abhors a lonely woman with a trunk full of secrets." Across the fire, a thick-necked man named Dutch spat into the coals. "They say she is a witch. Silas, say she cursed her husband." "They say a lot of things," Silas said. "They say Jacob Vance found the deed to the Miller claim, or a vein of silver, or a map to the Spanish stash. Does it matter? The point is, Jacob is dead, and the widow is sitting on his leavings like a dragon on a pile of bones." "What if she fights?" a younger man asked. He was cleaning a pistol, looking nervous. Silas laughed, a sound like dry leaves skittering on rock. "She is a widow. Caleb. She traps rabbits and grows turnips. She is not going to fight. She's going to cry, and then she is going to tell us where the money is, and then we are going to leave her to the winter. Loneliness makes people weak. It makes them grateful for any kind of attention, even the bad kind. You will see." He stood up, sliding the knife into his belt. "We ride at dusk. We will be at her door by nightfall. If she is smart, she will open it. If she is not, well, the ground is frozen hard enough to hide a lot of sins." Elias Thorne was dying, or at least it felt that way. He was moving along the timberline, keeping to the granite slabs where his boots would leave no prints. But he was stumbling. The wind bit through his canvas coat, seeking the warmth of his skin with cruel persistence. But the cold was secondary to the fire in his side. The bullet had only grazed him, a furrow of torn flesh along his ribs. But the knife, that had been the real problem. It had gone deep into his thigh before he had managed to kick the attacker away and scramble into the brush. He had bound it with a strip of his own shirt, but the blood had soaked through hours ago, stiffening the fabric into a frozen crimson plate against his leg. He stopped, leaning against a ponderosa pine, gasping for air. The air was too thin up here. It tasted of ice and resin. He was a stranger to this territory, and that had been his first mistake. In the town below, his dark complexion, a legacy of a Spanish mother and a father he had never known, had earned him looks ranging from suspicion to open hostility. He had been a scout for the army, a tracker for the railroads, a man who knew the shape of the land better than he knew the hearts of men. But here, he was just an outsider. He had been asking questions. That was his second mistake. He had been looking for a man named Jacob Vance, carrying a letter from a lawyer in Denver. He hadn't known Vance was dead. He hadn't known that asking about him would trigger a signal that brought 3 men out of the alley behind the saloon with knives drawn. "Run!" his instincts whispered. He pushed off the tree. He had lost them for now, but they were tracking him. He had seen their sign. Clumsy, heavy-handed, but persistent. They knew he was hurt. They were hurting him, pushing him higher into the mountains where the cold would finish the job for them. He stumbled again, his vision graying at the edges. He needed shelter. He needed heat. He needed to stop bleeding. Ahead, through a break in the trees, he saw a wisp of smoke rising against the gray sky. A cabin. It looked small, isolated, vulnerable. It looked like salvation. Elias took a step, and his leg buckled. He went down hard, the snow biting his face. He tried to rise, but his limbs felt like they were filled with lead shot. He dragged himself forward a few feet, his fingers clawing at the frozen earth. And then the darkness rose up to meet him. Mara was in the garden, mulching the last of the dormant roots with straw. When the crow stopped calling, it was sudden. One moment, the bird was cawing from the top of a dead spruce. The next, silence. Mara froze. She did not look up immediately. She stayed bent over the garden bed, her hands hidden in the straw, listening. The wind was blowing down from the ridge. If something was coming, the scent would reach her first. There! A faint, copper tang, blood, and something else, the scuff of a boot dragging over stone. She straightened slowly, wiping her hands on her apron. She moved to the side of the cabin where her rifle leaned against the wall. A Winchester lever action, oiled and ready. She jacked around into the chamber, the mechanical clack-clack distinct in the quiet air. She moved into the trees, her feet finding the silent places between the dry needles. She was not a gardener now. She was something else. She was the shadow moving through the shadows. She found the trail 50 yards from the cabin. It was a mess. Whoever this was, they were not trying to hide. They were falling, broken twigs, a disturbed patch of snow, a smear of red on a gray rock, bright and startling. Mara followed the sign, her rifle tucked into her shoulder, her finger resting alongside the trigger guard. She saw him before he saw anything. He was lying face down in the snow near the property line, a dark shape against the white. He was wearing a canvas coat that was too thin for this altitude, and his left leg was soaked in blood. Mara stood over him, looking down. Her first instinct was cold and practical. Leave him. He was trouble. A wounded man brought questions. He brought pursuers. If he died out here, the snow would cover him by morning. She could pretend she never saw him. She could go back to her warm stove and her silence. The man groaned, a low, ragged sound, and tried to push himself up. He rolled onto his side, his head lolling back. Mara saw his face. He was younger than she expected. His skin was dark, his cheekbones high and sharp, his hair black and matted with sweat despite the freezing air. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were glazed with pain, unfocused. But there was a stubbornness in them, a refusal to simply close and go dark. He looked like a man who had fought for every breath he had ever taken. He looked at her, seeing only a blurry figure in black standing against the sky. "Help," he whispered. It wasn't a demand, it was a prayer. Mara cursed softly. The sound was swallowed by the wind. She lowered the hammer of the rifle and slung it over her shoulder. "You are a fool for dying on my land," she said. She bent down, grabbing him under the arms. He was heavy, dead weight, but she was stronger than she looked. Years of hauling wood and dressing elk had put steel in her back. She grunted, heaving him up, dragging him backward through the snow. He cried out once, a sharp intake of breath, and then went limp. She did not stop. She dragged him with a disciplined urgency, her eyes scanning the tree line. If he was bleeding, he had been hurt by something, or someone. Inside the cabin, the world was fire and pain. Elias drifted in and out of consciousness. He felt hands, rough, strong hands, stripping the coat from his shoulders. He felt the tear of fabric as his pant leg was ripped open. Then came the heat, a wet, scalding heat that made him scream. "Quiet!" a voice commanded. It was a woman's voice, low and hard as granite. "If you scream, you bleed faster." He grit his teeth, forcing the sound back down his throat. He opened his eyes. The woman was leaning over him. She had a basin of steaming water and a pile of clean rags. Her face was severe, framed by severe dark hair pulled back tight. There was no pity in her expression, only a focused, terrifying competence. She cleaned the knife wound in his thigh with a ruthlessness that made his vision swim. She packed it with a poultice that smelled of sharp herbs and stinging pine, then bound it tight with strips of white cloth. "The rib is just a graze," she said, more to herself than him. "But you have lost blood. You are cold to the core." She stood up, wiping her hands on a towel. Elias tried to sit up, panic flaring in his chest. Where was he? Who was she? "I need my gun," he rasped. "They are coming." A hand pushed him back down. It wasn't gentle. It pressed against his sternum with undeniable force. "Lie down," she said. "You are not going anywhere. And if you bleed on my quilt, I will put you back outside." "The men," Elias gasped. "3 of them. Tracking me." Mara went still. The towel in her hand stopped moving. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. "How close?" "Close," Elias said. "Maybe an hour behind." Mara did not panic. She did not wring her hands or ask him why they were coming. She simply nodded. Once. She walked to the window, peering out through the heavy shutters. "Rest," she said. "If you talk, you use air. If you use air, you get dizzy. I do not have the patience to pick you up off the floor again." Elias watched her. She moved like a soldier. She checked the stove, adding a single log. She checked the door, dropping a heavy wooden bar into place. She picked up the rifle again, checking the load. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. She didn't answer. Dusk fell like a hammer. The light drained out of the valley, leaving the trees standing like black skeletons against the snow. Mara extinguished the oil lamp. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the dull red glow of the stove vents. She moved a chair to the narrow slit of the window that faced the trail, sitting with the rifle across her lap. "Do not move," she whispered into the dark. "Do not make a sound." Elias lay on the cot, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the tension in the room. It was thick, electric. He could see the silhouette of the woman against the faint gray light of the window. She was perfectly still. She wasn't trembling. She was waiting. Then he heard it, the crunch of snow, the heavy, muffled thud of hooves. They were here. Mara eased the barrel of the Winchester through the crack in the shutter. The metal made no sound against the wood. She had wrapped the barrel in a scrap of wool to dampen the noise. Outside, the wind had died down. The voices carried clearly. "Cabin is dark," a man's voice said, rough, impatient. "She is asleep," another voice answered, smooth, dangerous. "Or hiding. Check the perimeter, see if there is a back way." Mara watched through the sights. A figure detached itself from the shadows of the pines. A man on foot, moving low, a pistol in his hand. He crept toward the cabin, stepping carefully to avoid the patches of ice. He came close to the window, too close. He peered at the crack in the shutter, trying to see inside. Mara saw his face in a shaft of moonlight. He was grinning. He saw the black fabric of her dress through the crack, saw the lack of light, and he thought he had found a victim. He thought he had found a frightened widow hiding under her bed. "Easy prey," his posture said. Mara took a breath. She held it. She did not aim for his chest. That would bring the others down on the cabin in a storm of lead. She needed to send a message. She needed to speak a language they understood. She shifted the barrel a fraction of an inch. She aimed for the dead branch of the pine tree that hung directly beside the man's head, a thick, frozen knot of wood at ear level. She squeezed the trigger. Crack! The rifle shot was deafening in the small space. Outside, the branch exploded. Wood splinters sprayed the man's face like shrapnel. The bullet hissed past his ear, close enough that the shockwave felt like a physical slap, a ghostly finger tapping against his skull. The man yelled, stumbling back, dropping his pistol into the snow. He scrambled away on hands and knees, terror overriding dignity. "Jesus!" he screamed. "Jesus! She nearly took my head off!" From the tree line, voices shouted, horses whinnied in panic. "Get back!" the smooth voice yelled, losing its composure. "Pull back!" Mara worked the lever of the Winchester. Click-clack, a fresh round slid home. She did not fire again. She didn't need to. The thieves retreated into the darkness, the sound of their horses fading as they put distance between themselves and the cabin. They had expected a weeping woman. They had found something else. Inside, the silence returned, heavier than before. Mara sat by the window for a long time, watching the trees. Only when she was certain they were gone did she lower the rifle. She turned to look at the man on the cot. Elias was propped up on one elbow, staring at her. His eyes had adjusted to the gloom. He looked at the woman in the black dress, the black widow of the rumors. He saw the way she held the weapon, not with the desperate grip of a frightened homeowner, but with the loose, easy familiarity of a hunter. He didn't look afraid. He looked stunned. He looked like a man who had walked into a church and found a loaded cannon on the altar. "You missed," he said softly. "I never miss," Mara said. Her voice was flat, devoid of boasting. "If I wanted him dead, he would be dead. I wanted him to think about what happens next." She stood up and walked to the stove. opening the door to let the light spill out. She looked at Elias, her face illuminated by the firelight. It was a hard face, severe and beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. "Here's the rule," she said. "You heal quietly. You do not bring trouble to my door again, and you do not ask questions that I am not ready to answer. Do you understand?" Elias nodded slowly. "I understand." "Good." She turned back to the window, checking the lock. Outside, a mile down the trail, the thieves had stopped to regroup. The wind was picking up again, burying their tracks. The man who had approached the window, a thug named Caleb, was wiping blood from his cheek where a splinter had cut him. He was shaking, his hands vibrating so hard he could barely holster his gun. "I'm telling you, Silas," Caleb stammered. "It was dark, pitch black, and she put that bullet an inch from my ear. She didn't even open the shutter." Silas Vane sat on his horse, staring back up the trail toward the hidden cabin. His face was a mask of cold fury, but beneath it, there was a flicker of calculation. Caleb spat into the snow, the saliva pink with blood from his bitten lip. He rubbed his face, looking back into the dark woods with a haunted expression. "We thought we were robbing a black widow," he muttered, his voice cracking. "But that shot, that wasn't no widow's luck." He looked up at Silas, his eyes wide. "That shot was perfect. It was cold. It looked like something from a legend. Silas, it looked like the Snipe." The storm did not arrive with a shout, but with a suffocating silence. The sky, which had been a bruised iron color for 2 days, lowered itself until the peaks of the surrounding mountains were swallowed by a ceiling of gray vapor. The air grew heavy, static-charged, causing the fine hairs on Mara Vance's arms to stand up whenever she neared the window. It began as a dusting, fine as flour, drifting vertically in the windless air. Then the wind woke up. It came tearing down the canyon, turning the gentle drift into a blinding curtain of white ash that scoured the log walls of the cabin and hissed against the chimney. For 3 days, the world shrank. It consisted now only of the 20 by 20 foot interior of the cabin, a tight wooden box containing 2 people, a cast iron stove, and a silence that was becoming louder than the wind. Mara moved through the confinement with the economy of a machine. Her routine was a ritual of survival, performed with a grim dedication that Elias watched from his cot, at first light, or what passed for it in the gray gloom. She was up. She riddled the grate of the stove, feeding it split pine she had stacked against the wall. She melted snow in a large copper kettle, the water taking an eternity to boil at this altitude. She checked the drying meat hanging from the rafters, turning each strip to prevent mold. Elias watched her chop kindling on the hearthstone. She held the small hatchet choked up near the head, using short, precise strikes. Thwack! Thwack! There was no wasted motion. She did not raise the blade high. She let the weight of the steel do the work. "You are staring," Mara said without looking up. "There is not much else to look at," Elias replied. His voice was stronger than it had been 2 days ago, but he was still pale, his eyes bright with the lingering fever. "I can help with that. You can lie still," Mara said. She swept the splinters into a pile with a turkey wing. "If you tear that stitching, I do not have enough whiskey left to numb you for a second sewing." "I am useless lying here," he muttered, frustration edging his tone. "You are healing," she corrected. "Healing is work. It takes blood and energy. Do not spend it on pride." She moved to the kitchen table, where she began measuring coffee beans. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, 20. She put the rest back in the tin. It was a meager amount for a pot, barely enough to color the water, but she ground it by hand, the crunch of the pestle the only sound in the room. Elias pushed himself up to a sitting position. The room spun, gray and nauseating, but he gritted his teeth until it steadied. He watched her pour the water. He watched her hands. They were red from the cold, the knuckles swollen slightly, but steady. "You flinch," he said softly. Mara froze, the kettle suspended over the cup. "What?" "The wind," Elias said. "When a branch hits the roof, or when the log settles in the stove, you flinch, Just a little. In the shoulders. Mara set the kettle down with a sharp clank. She turned to him, her face darkening. I do not flinch, she said, but the defensive snap in her voice betrayed her. She hated that he saw it. She hated that he was a tracker, a man trained to read signs in bent grass and broken twigs. And now he was reading the broken things inside her. It is nothing to be ashamed of, Elias said, his voice even. It means you are listening. It means you are still alive. It means I am jumpy as a rabbit, she said bitterly. She brought him the cup, the coffee thin and steaming. Drink. It is the last pot for today. She went back to the table and opened a leather satchel. It was full of dried yarrow and willow bark, a tangled mess of stems and leaves. If you must work, she said, make yourself useful with your hands, not your back. Sort these, bark in the jar, leaves in the sack, and do not crush them. I need the leaves whole for poultices. She placed the pile on a tray and set it on his lap. It was a test. She wanted to see if his hands were steady, if he had the patience for the small, tedious work that made up 90% of survival. Elias took a breath and picked up a sprig of yarrow. His fingers, calloused from rains and rifle stocks, looked too large for the delicate work. But he moved with a surprising grace, separating the feathery leaves from the stalk without breaking them. They worked in silence for an hour, the storm hammering the roof. It was a strange, domestic tableau. The widow mending a seam in her heavy wool coat. The injured gunman sorting herbs, framed by the violence of the weather outside. The men who did this to you, Mara said, not looking up from her needle. Who are they? Elias hesitated. He stripped a piece of willow bark, the dry wood snapping softly. Hired guns, he said. The one with the mustache is Silas Vane. I have seen his face on wanted posters in Abilene, though usually for things harder to prove than robbery. The others are just muscle. And what were they tracking you for? You said it was about a witness. A witness to a land grab, Elias said. There is a syndicate buying up claims along the proposed rail line, or stealing them. They forge deeds, or they find reasons why the original owners cannot hold on to them. I was hired by a lawyer in Denver to find a man who saw them burn a farmhouse 3 years ago. The syndicate does not want him found. At the word deeds, Mara's needle stopped. She pricked her finger, a tiny bead of blood blooming on the tip. She stuck the finger in her mouth, tasting copper, her eyes unfocused. Deeds. The smell hit her first, not the coffee in the room, but the phantom scent of pine pitch and stale tobacco. She saw Jacob's hands, big and clumsy, holding a piece of paper by the light of this very stove. It is just a formality. Mara, Jacob had said, his voice thick with a worry he tried to hide. They say the survey lines were drawn wrong back in '65. They just want to check the markers. She remembered the way he had looked at the door, as if expecting a knock. He had left the next morning to meet the surveyor. He had never come back. Found him at the bottom of the ravine, the sheriff had said, twisting his hat in his hands. Must have slipped. It is treacherous ground. Mrs. Vance. But Jacob had been a mountain goat. He never slipped. Mara? Elias's voice brought her back. She blinked, the cabin walls rushing back into place. She wiped her finger on her apron. Deeds, she repeated, her voice flat. Men kill for less in this country. Elias watched her. He saw the way her jaw had set, the way the blood had drained from her face. He had seen that look before, on soldiers who heard a sound that reminded them of a battlefield. It is not just about the money, Elias said gently. It is about the erasure. They take the land, and then they take the name of the person who lived on it. They make it so you never existed. Mara stood up abruptly. The fire needs wood. She grabbed her coat and unbarred the door. The wind hit her like a physical blow, swirling snow into the room. She slipped out, slamming the heavy timbers shut behind her. Elias sat with the tray of herbs, listening to the thud, thud, thud of the axe from the lean-to shed attached to the cabin. She was chopping wood she didn't need, fighting ghosts with steel. When she returned, her cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, her eyes bright and hard. She stamped the snow from her boots and dropped an armload of split pine by the stove. "The town," she said, shedding her coat. She spoke as if there had been no interruption. "They do not hate me because I am a widow, and they do not hate me because they think I have gold." She walked to the window, staring out at the white oblivion. "They hate me because every time they see me, they remember that they let it happen. They know Jacob did not fall. They know the surveyor was paid off. But it is easier to believe I'm a witch or a black widow who cursed him than to admit they are cowards who let a good man be murdered for a railroad right-of-way." Elias looked at her back, rigid and straight as a rifle barrel. He understood now. The isolation wasn't just protection. It was an indictment. Her very existence was an accusation against the town of Clearwater. "It is a heavy thing," Elias said, "to be a mirror for other people's sins." Mara turned, her expression softening just a fraction. "It is lonely," she said. The wind howled, a long, mournful note that vibrated in the chimney. And then, cutting through the wind, came a voice. "Hello, the house!" It was a cheerful shout, loud and mocking. Mara moved instantly. She blew out the lantern. The cabin plunged into gray twilight. She grabbed the Winchester from its rack and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. "Mrs. Vance," the voice called again. It was the smooth one. "Silas Vane. We know you are in there. Darlin', we saw the smoke. It is mighty cold out here for Christian men to be standing in the snow." Elias threw off the quilt. He swung his legs over the edge of the cot, his face twisting with pain as the blood rushed to his injured thigh. He reached for his pistol belt hanging on the chair. Mara waved a hand at him, a sharp, cutting motion. "Stay down." "Go away!" Mara shouted through the door. Her voice was not shrill. It was the voice she used to command a mule, low and resonant. "Now, is that neighborly?" Silas shouted back. "We just wanted to check on you. A storm like this, a woman alone. Things happen. Trees fall. Roofs cave in. We would hate for anything to happen to you. Widow Vance, you have had so much tragedy already." Laughter rippled from the other men. It was an ugly sound, sharp and serrated. "We have fresh venison," another voice yelled. "Maybe we can trade. Some meat for a little hospitality?" "I have a rifle," Mara said, "and I have the will to use it. Step onto the porch and you will not step off." "She is feisty," the rough voice laughed. "I like them feisty. Makes the quiet after so much sweeter." Elias stood up. The insult hit him like a physical slap. The rage flared in his chest, hot and blinding, burning away the weakness in his legs. He racked the slide of his pistol, staggering toward the door. He was going to kill them. He was going to open the door and empty the gun into the snow. Mara turned and saw him. He was swaying, his face gray as ash, but his eyes were burning. She crossed the room in 2 strides. She didn't push him. She placed her hand flat against the center of his chest. "Stop," she whispered. Her palm was calloused, but warm. Through the thin fabric of his shirt, he could feel the strength in her arm. She held him there, anchoring him. "Do not give them what they want," she hissed, her face inches from his. "They want you to open the door. They want to fight. They want to drag us out into the snow. They are insulting you," Elias growled, his hand trembling on the grip of his pistol. "They are words," Mara said. "I have heard worse. Look at me." Elias looked. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of intensity. She was afraid. He could see the pulse fluttering in her throat, but she was holding the fear in a chokehold. "If we open that door, we die," she said. "The wind is their friend, not ours. They have numbers. We have the walls. Stand down. Elias." It was the first time she'd used his name. The sound of it broke the red haze of his anger. He felt the pain in his leg come rushing back, a sickening throb that nearly buckled his knees. He leaned into her hand, needing the support. For a moment, they stood frozen in the dim light, her hand on his heart, his breath ragged against her forehead. The heat between them was sudden and undeniable, a spark jumping a gap. It wasn't just survival. It was the recognition of shared fire. Outside, the horses stomped, Suit yourself! Widow! Silas called, his voice losing its playful edge. Enjoy the cold. We will be back when you are hungry enough to be polite. And Mrs. Vance, don't think that door will hold forever. The sound of hoofbeats retreated, muffled by the deepening snow. Mara did not move until the silence returned completely. Then she stepped back, dropping her hand from his chest as if she had been burned. She turned away, walking to the stove. Her hands, which had been steady on the rifle and steady on his chest, were suddenly shaking violently. She grabbed the cast-iron skillet from the hook. "I need to clean this," she muttered. "It has grease on it." She carried it to the wash basin. There was no grease on it. It was already seasoned black and clean, but she scrubbed it anyway, the rags screeching against the iron. Her shoulders hunched. She scrubbed until her knuckles were white. Elias sat heavily on the nearest chair. He watched her back. He knew that shake. It was the adrenaline leaving the blood, the terror that comes after the danger has passed. "Mara," he said softly. She scrubbed harder. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should not have tried to open the door. You were right." Mara stopped scrubbing. She rested her forehead against the cool logs of the wall, breathing hard. "They treat you like you are nothing," Elias said. "Like you are a thing to be broken open and checked for valuables." Mara turned. Her face was pale, stripped of its usual armor. "They treat me like a woman with no one to stand for her," she said. "In this world, that is the same thing as being nothing." Elias looked at his hands, resting on his knees. "I know what it is," he said quietly. "To be judged before you speak. To have men look at you and decide your worth based on a story they invented in their own heads. My mother was Apache. My father was a Spanish soldier who passed through. I have been half-breed, mongrel, and savage, in every town from Tucson to Denver. I have been guilty of stealing horses I never saw and starting fights I tried to stop." He looked up, meeting her gaze. "I know what it is to be a villain because it is convenient for everyone else." Mara looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the scars on his hands, the weary set of his shoulders, the intelligence in his eyes that had been sharpened by a lifetime of looking over his shoulder. She put the pan down. She dried her hands. "Your bandage," she said, her voice quiet. "You move too much. It needs to be checked." She came to him, kneeling on the floorboards. She rolled up his pant leg. The movement had indeed started the bleeding again. A fresh blossom of red stained the white linen. "I told you," she murmured, but there was no bite in her tone. She unwrapped the cloth. Her fingers were gentle, avoiding the tender edges of the wound. She cleaned it again with the witch hazel, her touch surprisingly soft. Elias winced when the cold liquid hit the raw flesh. Mara paused. Her hand hovered over his leg. She looked up. "I am sorry," she whispered. "It is all right," he said. Their eyes locked. The cabin was cold, the air smelling of wood smoke and snow. But in that small circle of lamplight, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. It was the intimacy of being the only two people on earth who understood the language of the other's pain. She did not pull away this time. She finished wrapping the leg, pinning the cloth securely. Then she rested her hand on his knee for just a second, a reassurance, a silent pact, before standing up. "Night is coming," she said. "The storm will be worse before morning." They did not sleep. The wind battered the cabin with a fury that felt personal, shaking the roof timbers and driving snow through the smallest chinks in the mortar. They moved the chairs close to the stove, sitting back to back. It was a tactical position, eyes on the door, eyes on the window, but it was also a way to share warmth. Mara could feel the solid presence of his back against hers, the rise and fall of his breathing. It anchored her. Hours passed in the dark. "My mother used to sing to the corn," Elias said, his voice rumbling through his chest and into her spine. "She said if you didn't sing to it, it would grow bitter. She had a song for the rain, too. I haven't thought of that in 20 years. My father was a tanner in Ohio," Mara said into the darkness. "He smelled like oak bark and lye. He taught me that everything has a grain. Wood, leather, people. If you cut against the grain, you ruin it. You have to find the way it wants to go. And which way do you want to go, Mara? Away, she admitted. I always wanted to go west. I thought it would be big enough that I wouldn't have to be afraid. I thought if I went far enough, the world would stop trying to squeeze me into a shape I didn't fit. The West is big, Elias agreed. But people are small. They bring their smallness with them. Mara pulled the rifle across her lap. She opened the breech, checking the mechanism by feel. She wiped the unseen dust from the sights with her thumb. Elias turned his head slightly. I saw you yesterday, he said, with the rifle. When you shot the branch. I told you, she said. I didn't want to kill him. It wasn't just that you didn't kill him, Elias said. It was the way you held the weapon. Most men, even soldiers, they fight the gun. They wrestle it. You held it like it was a part of your arm. You measured the wind, the drop, the light, all in a heartbeat. It was artistry. Mara stiffened. Artistry is for paintings, for needlepoint. This is a tool. It is a crowbar to pry open another day of living. It is more than that, he insisted. You have a gift. Where did you learn to shoot like that? Ohio tanners don't teach that. Mara was silent for a long time. The wolves had started howling again, their voices weaving through the wind, lonely and hungry. I didn't learn in Ohio, she said softly, and I didn't learn from Jacob. She closed the breech of the rifle. The metallic click was loud in the room. I learned because I was alone, she said. Before Jacob, there was a winter in the Dakotas. My first husband, he died of fever. I was 20. The Sioux were moving through, and there were renegades. And there were white men worse than renegades. I sat on a roof for 3 weeks with a Sharp's buffalo gun. She turned her head, looking into the dark corner of the room. I learned to shoot because nobody was coming, she said. I learned that if I missed, I ceased to exist. Elias didn't speak. He let the weight of her words settle between them. He understood now the steel in her spine, the silence, the way she watched the tree line. She wasn't just a widow grieving a husband. She was a survivor of a war she had fought alone. You are not alone now, he said. The words hung in the air, fragile as smoke. Mara didn't answer, but she shifted slightly, leaning a little more of her weight against his back. Eventually, the rhythm of his breathing deepened. His head lolled forward. He was asleep, exhausted by the pain and the cold. Mara stayed awake. She sat in the dark, the rifle across her knees, listening to the storm and the wolves. But for the first time in years, the silence of the cabin did not feel empty. She could feel the heat of the man behind her, a solid, living proof that she was not a ghost in her own life. The danger was closer than ever. Silas Vane was out there, and he would come back with fire and lead. But the terror had changed shape. It was no longer the terror of the solitary animal waiting for the end. It was the terror of having something to lose. She watched the embers in the stove glow like dying stars, and she realized with a jolt of panic and hope that she was planning for tomorrow. Not just surviving it, but fighting for it. She was no longer just the Black Widow, and the snow, banking high against the door, felt less like a tomb and more like a fortress. The storm broke on the 4th morning, leaving behind a world that looked less like a landscape and more like a bone picked clean. The sky was a terrifying, brilliant blue, devoid of clouds, and the sun that rose over the Sawtooth Ridge offered light but no heat. The temperature had plummeted, snapping the moisture out of the air until every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. Mara Vance stood on the porch, her boots crunching on the diamond-hard drift that had banked against the door. The silence was absolute. It was not the peaceful silence of solitude. It was the heavy, oppressive silence of judgment. The pines stood black and motionless under the weight of the snow, like mourners at a funeral no one had attended. She felt a presence behind her. Elias Thorne was leaning in the doorway, wrapped in a blanket over his mended clothes. He was moving better today, the limp less pronounced, the fever that had glazed his eyes replaced by a sharp, restless clarity. "It will freeze the lungs of a horse today," Elias said quietly. "It will freeze the soul of a man," Mara corrected, pulling her scarf tighter. "We need wood. The pile is low. We need more than wood. Mara." She stiffened, her hand freezing on the porch rail. She did not turn around. "We wait," she said. "The pass is blocked. Silas Vane is not a fool. He will not ride into this until the crust hardens." "Vane is a hired dog," Elias said, stepping out onto the porch. The cold hit him, but he didn't flinch. "He comes when he is called, and the man holding the leash is in town. If they are after deeds, if this is about land claims, then your cabin is just one knot in a very long rope. We cannot sit here and wait for them to cut it." Mara turned then, her eyes hard. "I have survived 3 years by sitting here, by being the ghost in the woods. Hiding kept me alive." "Hiding let them write your story for you," Elias countered. His voice was not unkind, but it was relentless. "They call you the Black Widow. They say you killed Jacob. As long as you hide, you are pleading guilty to a crime you didn't commit." Mara looked at him. He was thin, his face hollowed by the injury, but there was a steel in him that matched her own. He was right, and she hated him for it. Hiding had been her armor, but armor could also be a cage. "If we go to town," she said, measuring the words, "we walk into the wolf's den. You are a wanted man, or close enough to it, and I am what I am. Then we go carefully," Elias said. "We find out who is pulling Vane's strings. We find out what Jacob knew." Mara looked back at the frozen tree line. She thought of the trunk at the foot of her bed, the brass lock cold against her skin when she touched it in the dark. "Get your boots," she said. "If we are going, we leave now, before the sun softens the drifts." The journey to Clearwater was a brutal slog. They took the game trails, staying off the main road where the snow was waist-deep. The wind had scoured the ridges bare, leaving slick, black rock that was treacherous to navigate. Mara moved with a grim, rhythmic pace, breaking trail. Elias followed, his breathing labored but steady. He never complained, though she saw him stumbling when the terrain grew steep, his hand going to his bandaged thigh. They reached the edge of town just past noon. Clearwater looked deceptively picturesque under the snow, smoke rising in straight gray columns from brick chimneys, the false front buildings lining the main street like a stage set. But as they walked out of the tree line and onto the packed slush of the road, the illusion shattered. The town felt hostile. It wasn't just the cold, it was the eyes. As they passed the livery stable, a stable hand paused in his work. Holding a pitchfork, he stared at Mara, his gaze sliding over her black dress with a mixture of superstition and distaste. Then he looked at Elias, at his dark skin, his high cheekbones, the way he walked with a slight drag in his left leg. The man spat a stream of tobacco juice into the snow, a bright brown stain near Elias's boot. Elias didn't break stride. He kept his head up, his eyes moving constantly, scanning rooftops and alleyways. "Keep close," he murmured. "Do not stop for anyone." They entered the general store. The bell jingled, a cheerful sound that died instantly in the heavy air of the room. The stove in the center was surrounded by the usual court of idlers, men with red faces and nothing to do but judge. The conversation cut off like a severed wire. Mara walked to the counter. She felt the weight of the room pressing against her back. She kept her chin down, placing a few coins on the wood. "Coffee," she said to Mr. Henderson, "and a tin of lard." Henderson was a balding man with a nervous tick in his left eye. He looked at the coins, then at Mara, then over her shoulder at Elias, who was standing near the door, feigning interest in a display of horsetack. "Price is up," Henderson said. He didn't look at her. He looked at a spot on the wall behind her head. "Storm closed the supply wagons. Coffee is $2 a pound." Mara's hand tightened on the counter. It was robbery. $2 was double the price of last week. "I have $1.50, she said. "Then you have 3/4 of a pound, Henderson said flatly. He began to scoop the beans, his movements jerky. From the stove, a voice floated over, loud, performative. "See, she has got a new shadow," a man said. Dark one, too. Guess the widow got lonely up there in the rocks. Collected another man to keep the bed warm. Careful, Jeb, another voice snickered. She will bury this one too before the thaw. Mara felt the heat rise in her neck, a flush of humiliation that burned hotter than the cold outside. She wanted to turn. She wanted to scream that Jacob had been worth 10 of them, that she was not a collector of men but a woman trying to survive a world that wanted her dead. She did nothing. She took the small sack of coffee. She waited for her change. Henderson busied himself with a ledger. A minute passed. 2. My change, Mr. Henderson, she said softly. Oh, he said, looking up with feigned surprise. I thought you left it for the poor box, seeing as you are so charitable with strangers. He slapped a few coins onto the counter. It was short, 10 cents short. Mara looked at the coins. She looked at Henderson. To argue was to make a scene. To make a scene was to give them what they wanted. She swept the coins into her palm and turned. Elias was waiting. He had not moved, but his body was coiled tight. His eyes were fixed on the men by the stove, a flat, reptilian stare that had silenced the laughter. He opened the door for her, and they stepped back out into the biting wind. They are small men, Elias said quietly as they walked away. Do not let them make you small. They are the town, Mara said bitterly. They are the law and the commerce. Being big does not help when they own the ground you stand on. They tried the bank next. Mara wanted to ask about the mortgage on her cabin, to see if Jacob had left a note on the file. The clerk, a young man with pomaded hair, took one look at them and put a sign in the window. Closed for lunch. It was 2 o'clock. They tried the land office. The door was locked. Through the glass, they could see the surveyor sitting at his desk, drinking whiskey. He looked up, saw them, and pointedly turned his chair around to face the wall. Someone has been talking, Elias said. Doors do not close this fast by accident. Vane has been here, or the man who pays him. They were walking past the sheriff's office when the door opened. Deputy Miller stepped out, hitching his gun belt. He was a thick-set man with a face like a slab of raw beef. Hold up there, Miller said. They stopped. Mara felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. Miller ignored her. He walked up to Elias, invading his space, standing close enough that his breath steamed in Elias's face. You are the drifter, Miller said. It wasn't a question. We had reports of a man matching your description causing trouble over in Granite Creek. Horse theft. I have no horse. Deputy, Elias said. His voice was calm, polite, weaponized compliance. And I have been in the territory 3 days. My papers are in my pocket. I don't care about your papers, Miller sneered. He looked at the bandage visible through the tear in Elias's trousers. You look like you ran into some trouble, maybe a bullet. We don't like trouble in Clearwater. Boy, we like things quiet. He turned his gaze to Mara. His eyes raked over her, stripping away her dignity. You run along home, widow, and take your stray dog with you. If I see him on the street after sundown, I will arrest him for vagrancy. And if he resists, well, accidents happen. Miller turned and went back inside. Mara was shaking, not from cold, from rage. We need to go, she said. Not yet, Elias said. There is one more place. You mentioned a teacher, a midwife, someone who knew Jacob. Mrs. Gable, Mara said. She lives behind the schoolhouse, but if she is seen with us, we will not be seen, Elias said. Lead the way. Martha Gable's house was a tiny, clapboard structure that smelled of dried lavender and chalk dust. She opened the back door at Mara's tentative knock, her face wrinkling in surprise, then concern. Mara, she breathed. Child, come in, quickly. She ushered them into a small back parlor, pulling the heavy velvet curtains tight. She was a woman in her 60s, with hands twisted by arthritis, but eyes that were sharp and kind. She looked at Elias, then at Mara, and nodded as if answering a question she hadn't asked. I heard about the trouble, Mrs. Gable whispered. She bustled to a sideboard, pouring tea from a porcelain pot. The whole town is buzzing like a kicked hive. They say you shot a man. Mara, I shot a tree, Mara said, taking the cup. Her hands were numb. The china felt dangerously hot. The man was just standing too close to it. Mrs. Gable smiled, a fleeting, sad expression. Jacob always said you had an eye. He was so proud of you, you know, even when you were hiding from the world. She sat down opposite them, smoothing her apron. Why are you here? It isn't safe. We need to know who is buying the land, Elias said. He sat on the edge of a chair, refusing the tea, watching the door. Who hired Silas Vane? Mrs. Gable sighed. It is the Consolidated Rail Company, or a shell of it. But the man signing the local checks is Councilman Sterling, Mara gasped. Sterling! He spoke at Jacob's funeral. He cried. He is a crocodile. Mrs. Gable said. He has been buying up the valley for 2 years. Widows, bachelors, anyone without a loud voice. If they sell, good. If they don't, they have accidents, or they get tired of the harassment and leave. Elias leaned forward. This is not just land speculation. It is fraud. If they are forging deeds, they need the originals to disappear, or they need the owners to sign them over before they die. He looked at Mara. That is why Vane didn't burn you out the first night, he said. He needs something from you. He needs Jacob's papers. He needs the original claim to make the forgery stand up in federal court. The room seemed to tilt. Mara set her cup down. The trunk. She had always known the trunk was important, but she had treated it like a reliquary, a box of holy sadness. She hadn't thought of it as evidence. Jacob wrote a letter, she whispered. The night before he left, he put it in the trunk with the survey map. He said if anything happened, I should give it to the marshal in Denver. You have the letter? Elias asked. His voice was intense. I have never opened the trunk, Mara confessed. I couldn't. Opening it meant admitting he was gone forever. And keeping it locked, Elias said gently, might be the reason you are next. He did not ask for the key. He did not demand she hand over the papers. He sat back, his hands open on his knees. It is your choice, Mara. But that trunk is the only weapon we have left that shoots further than a Winchester. She looked at him. In a world where men took what they wanted, land, dignity, life, he was waiting for her permission. The respect hit her harder than the deputy's insults. It made her throat tight. I will open it, she said. Mrs. Gable reached out and patted Mara's arm. You stay here a moment. Rest. I have some bread proving in the kitchen. When the older woman left, the room fell quiet. The air was warm, smelling of yeast and tea, a stark contrast to the violence outside. Elias stood and moved to the window, peering through the gap in the curtain. He was standing close to her chair. She could smell him, wood smoke, wool, and the faint, metallic scent of blood from his wound. He wasn't touching her, but his presence was a physical weight, a source of heat. He looked down at her. His hand drifted near her shoulder, brushing the rough fabric of her sleeve. Mara stiffened. It was a reflex, a flinch born of 3 years of solitude. Elias froze. He pulled his hand back instantly, tucking it into his pocket. I apologize, he said stiffly. No, Mara said. She looked up at him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Do not apologize. I am just out of practice. He held her gaze. I am not a patient man, Mara, but I can learn. They left an hour later, slipping out the back way. They made it back to the tree line without being stopped. But the sense of being watched scratched at the back of Mara's neck like a briar. When they reached the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the peaks, casting long, purple shadows across the snow. The cold was deepening, a physical weight that pressed against the eardrums. Mara did not go inside immediately. She went to the shed and retrieved a box of cartridges. What are you doing? Elias asked, leaning against the porch rail. I need to clear my head, she said. And I need to be sure the cold hasn't warped the barrel? She walked 50 yards into the trees. She pinned a playing card, the ace of spades, found in Jacob's old things, to the trunk of a dead pine. She walked back to the porch, 100 yards. She raised the Winchester. She did not aim in the way Elias had seen soldiers aim, with squinting eyes and held breath. She simply brought the stock to her shoulder, both eyes open, and fired. Crack! The sound rolled down the valley, sharp and flat. Elias walked to the tree. He pulled the card free. The bullet had punched a clean hole through the center of the black spade. He walked back, holding the card up. 100 yards, he said, standing, iron sights, in freezing wind. Mara jacked the lever, ejecting the spent shell. It hissed as it hit the snow. I aimed for the top of the spade, she critiqued herself. It dropped an inch. The powder is burning slow because of the cold. Elias looked at her. He looked at the rifle. There was a shooter, he said slowly. Up in the Dakotas about 5 years back. Worked the perimeter of the mining camps during the Sioux troubles. They said this shooter could take the eye out of a coyote at 400 yards. They never saw him. They just found the bodies. They called him the Snipe because he was impossible to find. Mara lowered the rifle. She looked at the snow. They said he was a man, Elias continued, because nobody believed a woman could hold a perimeter alone. It wasn't a mining camp, Mara said, her voice hollow. It was a settlement, families. The men were dead or drunk. The soldiers had pulled back. There were raiders, men who liked to burn things. She looked up at him, her eyes dark and old. I didn't do it for money. I did it because there were children in the cellar of the church. I sat on the bell tower for 3 nights. I stopped counting after the first night. You are the Snipe, Elias said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a naming. Mara said. I buried that name when I met Jacob. I wanted to be a wife. I wanted to plant a garden. I wanted to forget what it felt like to play God with a piece of lead. You cannot bury a skill like that, Elias said. It is part of you. It is the reason you are still breathing. It is the reason I am damned, she whispered. They returned to the cabin in silence, but as they crested the final rise, the smell stopped them. It wasn't wood smoke. It was the acrid, oily stench of burning tar and kerosene. No, Mara gasped. They ran. The cabin was standing, dark and silent, but the small outbuilding, the root cellar and storage shed at the edge of the clearing, was a smoldering ruin. The roof had collapsed. The door was a charred skeleton, and nailed to the front door of the cabin was a piece of paper. Mara tore it down. Her hands shook so hard she could barely read the scrawl. Next time it is the house, or the old woman in town. Give us the trunk. Noon tomorrow. Leave it by the creek. They went to Mrs. Gable's, Mara choked out. They watched us. Elias took the note from her. His face was terrifyingly calm. They are squeezing. They want you to panic. They threaten Martha, Mara shouted, the control finally snapping. She has nothing to do with this. She is an innocent woman. There are no innocent people in this. Mara, Elias snapped back, his voice rising to match hers. There are only targets and threats. This is war. I am not a soldier anymore. You are. He grabbed her shoulders, spinning her to face him. You are the Snipe. You are the only thing standing between that old woman and a pine box. You cannot run from this. If we leave, they burn the house. They hurt Mrs. Gable just to spite you. They win. So we fight? Mara pushed him back, her chest heaving. 2 people against a gang? Against the town council? That is suicide, Elias. It is justice. I don't care about justice. I care about living. Do you? Elias stepped closer, invading her space, his eyes blazing. Is this living, hiding in the dark, waiting for them to come? That is just dying slowly. Mara, I would rather die on my feet than on my knees in the snow. They were standing inches apart in the fading light, the smell of smoke around them. The anger was a physical thing, a live current arcing between them. But beneath the anger was fear, terror, raw and bleeding. And beneath the fear was something else, adrenaline, need. The desperate animal hunger of 2 people standing on the edge of a cliff. Mara looked up at him. She saw the blood pulse in his neck. She saw the way his hands were clenched, wanting to shake her or hold her. He didn't know which. I'm afraid, she whispered, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a trembling vulnerability. I know, Elias said. His voice dropped to a rough murmur. I am too. He reached out, his hand cupping her face. His thumb brushed her cheekbone, rough skin against soft. She didn't flinch. She leaned into it. The kiss wasn't gentle. It was a collision. Mara grabbed the lapels of his coat, pulling him down. Elias wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her flush against him, crushing the air from her lungs. It was a kiss that tasted of cold air and desperation, a claiming in the face of oblivion. It was an argument and an answer, all at once. They broke apart, gasping, their foreheads resting against each other. The cold air rushed back in between them, but the heat remained. We cannot stay out here, Elias breathed. No, Mara said. Inside, the cabin was freezing. The fire had burned down to embers. They did not speak. Words felt too small, too clumsy after the explosion on the porch. Mara rebuilt the fire, her hands shaking for a different reason now. Elias barred the door, then checked the window shutters, wedging a chair under the handle. They ate a cold supper of dried meat and biscuit. Sitting on the floor near the stove, the tension was still there, but it had changed. It wasn't the jagged tension of conflict. It was the heavy, magnetic pull of gravity. When the fire died down, the cold returned with a vengeance. The thermometer on the porch would be reading 20 below zero. The blankets, Mara said, her voice tight. We need to combine them. It was a practical statement, survival. But in the small room, it sounded like a confession. They piled the quilts on the narrow bed. They lay down fully clothed, still wearing their heavy wool sweaters. Mara lay against the wall. Elias lay on the outside, facing the door, his pistol on the floorboards within reach. It was awkward at first. They lay rigid, careful not to touch. But the cold was a relentless enemy. It seeped through the cracks, through the wool, into the bone. Come here, Elias whispered. It wasn't a command. It was an invitation. Mara turned over. She shifted backward until her back was pressed against his chest. He exhaled, a long, ragged sound, and wrapped his arm around her waist. He pulled her tight against him, his chin resting on the top of her head. She could feel the beat of his heart against her spine. She could feel the heat radiating from him, pooling around them under the heavy quilts. It was not sexual. It was something more primal. It was the only way to survive the night. But as the hours passed, and the wind howled outside like a disappointed ghost, the nature of the embrace shifted. Mara's hand moved. She found his hand where it rested on her stomach. She interlaced her fingers with his. His grip tightened instantly. He held her hand like it was a lifeline, in the dark, with the smell of smoke still clinging to their hair. Mara stared at the brass lock of the trunk at the foot of the bed. It glinted in the faint orange glow from the stove vents. She thought of Jacob. She thought of the letter. She thought of Mrs. Gable, terrified in her parlor. She thought of the burned shed, and she felt the man behind her, the man who knew her name, who knew her shame, and who had kissed her like he wanted to breathe for her. She squeezed Elias's hand. Tomorrow, she whispered into the dark. Tomorrow, he answered. We do not run, she said. She felt him nod against her hair. We fight. Mara closed her eyes. She knew what she had to do. The hiding was over. The Black Widow was dead. The Snipe had to return. She slid her hand out of his, reached into the pocket of her dress, and pulled out a small, iron key. She held it tight in her fist, the metal biting into her palm. Elias? Yes? The trunk, she said. Open it. He didn't argue. He didn't ask if she was sure. He sat up in the freezing dark, the cold air rushing into the bed, and took the key from her hand. The click of the lock opening sounded like a gunshot. The lock of the trunk had clicked open, revealing not gold, but paper. Inside lay the anatomy of a murder, a surveyor's original map marked in red ink, a letter written in a hand that shook with premonition, and a deed that predated the railroad's claim by 5 years. For 2 hours, the cabin was silent save for the scratch of a pen. Mara sat at the table, transcribing the documents. Her handwriting was cramped and sharp, a mirror of her tension. Elias stood by the window, watching the white darkness, his presence a steady anchor in the room. "We cannot take the originals," Elias said, his voice low. "If they catch us on the road, if they search us, the papers burn, and the truth burns with them." "I know," Mara said, not looking up. "I am making 2 copies. One goes in the oilskin pouch under the floorboards. One goes with us, the originals." She paused, dipping the pen into the ink well. "The originals go into the woods." She finished the last line and sanded the wet ink. When she looked at him, her face was not the face of a grieving widow. It was the face of a tactician. "There is a hollow spruce 3 miles east, near the split rock," she said. "I used it for caching pelts when the wolves were bad. It is dry, and it looks like rot from the outside. No one touches it." "Good," Elias said. "We move at first light. We need to reach the federal marshal in Silverton. It is a 3-day ride, or a 5-day walk." "We walk," Mara said. "Horses leave a trail a blind man could follow in this snow. We use snowshoes until the crust breaks. Then we stick to the scree where our boots won't print." She stood up and moved to the hearth, kneeling to pry up a loose stone. Beneath it was a small tin box containing beeswax, sulfur matches, and a bird call carved from bone. "If we get separated," she said, handing him the bone whistle. "You do not yell. Sound carries too far in the cold. You use this. 2 short bursts means danger. 3 long calls mean stillness. Freeze where you are." Elias turned the bone whistle in his hands. It was old, smooth from years of touch. "And 1 call? 1 call means I am coming for you," she said. Elias watched her. She was planning contingencies for death, for separation, for war. He saw the layers of her past unfolding, the woman who had held a perimeter alone, the woman who knew that hope was a poor substitute for preparation. "You have a blind spot," Elias said gently. Mara bristled, her defense mechanism instant. "Where?" "The ridge route," he said, pointing to the map on the table. "You want to take the high ground to avoid the road, but with my leg, I will slow you down on the ascent. We will be exposed against the skyline for 2 hours. Any shooter in the valley will have a silhouette target." Mara looked at the map, then at his leg. She had been thinking like a solo hunter, not a partner. "You are right," she admitted, the words tasting like ash. "My pride. I wanted the high ground because it feels safer, but it would kill us." "We take the creek bed," Elias suggested. "It is frozen. We will have cover from the banks. It is slower, but we will be invisible." Mara nodded. "The creek bed." She looked at him with a new kind of respect. He was not just a gun hand. He was a man who knew the cost of terrain. And more importantly, he was a man who admitted his own weakness so it wouldn't become their coffin. Before they could leave the valley, they needed supplies that the cabin could not provide. Ammunition for his pistol and dry beans for the trail. It meant one last trip into Clearwater. They entered the town like ghosts, moving through the gray mid-morning light. The atmosphere had shifted since their last visit. It was no longer just cold. It was poisonous. As they passed the livery stable, conversation stopped. Men leaned on pitchforks, watching. A woman sweeping her boardwalk paused, whispered something to her neighbor, and pulled her children inside. "The net is tightening," Elias murmured, his eyes scanning the rooftops. "Vane has been busy." They reached the general store. On the door, a fresh notice had been pinned. It was a crude drawing of a spider in a web, and beneath it, scrawled in charcoal, "The widow lures. The fool follows." Mara reached out to tear it down, but Elias caught her wrist. "Leave it," he said. "Let them see we do not care." Inside, the store was crowded. The warmth of the stove seemed to evaporate the moment they stepped across the threshold. "Mr." Henderson was behind the counter, but standing near him was Councilman Sterling, a man with a silver watch chain across a vast stomach and eyes like polished marbles. Sterling turned slowly. He held a lit cigar, the smoke drifting around his head like a halo of smog. "Well," Sterling said, his voice booming for the benefit of the audience, "if it isn't the grieving widow and her Assistant, the room snickered. It was a nervous, ugly sound. Mara walked to the counter. 10 pounds of beans, Mr. Henderson, and 2 boxes of .45 caliber rounds. Henderson looked at Sterling. Sterling nodded, a small, permissive dip of his chin. We are all out of ammunition, Mrs. Vance. Henderson lied, his eyes on the floor. Supply wagon is late. I see the boxes on the shelf behind you, Mara said, her voice steady. Reserved. Sterling interjected. For the deputy. Law and order comes first, you understand, especially with dangerous rumors floating about. He took a step toward Mara. He smelled of expensive tobacco and brandy. You know, Mara, he said, using her first name with a familiarity that made her skin crawl. It is a shame to see you like this. Jacob was a good man. He would be heartbroken to see his wife parading around town with a drifter, making a mockery of her mourning. That black dress is starting to look less like grief and more like a costume you wear to garner sympathy. The insult hung in the air, gross and heavy. He was telling the town that her pain was a performance. He was stripping her of the one protection she had left. Mara felt the rage rise in her throat, a scream building behind her teeth. She wanted to claw his face. She wanted to tell them all that Sterling had signed the order that killed her husband, but to speak was to reveal the papers. To speak was to die. She smiled. It was a tight, terrible smile that didn't touch her eyes. Thank you for your concern, Councilman, she said. I will pray for your conscience. It must be a heavy burden to carry. She turned and walked out. Elias followed, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol, his glare daring anyone to speak. They walked in silence until they reached the edge of town, near a stand of cottonwoods by the river. The wind was biting, but the humiliation burned hotter. Mara stopped. She walked behind the trunk of a massive tree, out of sight of the road. She leaned her forehead against the rough bark. Her shoulders began to shake. She made no sound, but the tears came, hot, angry, humiliating tears. She hated them. She hated that Sterling's words had found a crack in her armor. She hated that she was crying in the snow while men who stole lives drank brandy by a fire. She heard Elias's boots crunch in the snow. He didn't touch her. He didn't offer a handkerchief or tell her it would be all right. He simply sat down on a fallen log a few feet away, placing himself between her and the world. I am not weak, she choked out, wiping her face furiously with her glove. I know, Elias said. He made it sound like Jacob was nothing, like my life is a lie. He is a small man with a big voice, Elias said. He uses shame because he has no courage. He picked up a stick and drew a line in the snow. When I was a scout for the 3rd Cavalry, he said quietly. There was a village on the Purgatoire River, peaceful. They had a treaty paper signed by a general. I led the unit there because the captain said we were bringing supplies. Mara turned, watching him. He was staring at the line in the snow. It wasn't supplies, he said. It was slaughter. I tried to stop them. I took a swing at the captain. They pistol-whipped me and tied me to a wagon wheel while they burned the lodges. He looked up at her. His eyes were dark with old pain. When we got back to the fort, the captain wrote the report. He said I led them into an ambush. He said I was a traitor who tried to get good soldiers killed. I spent 6 months in the stockade. The men spat on me when I walked to the mess hall. They called me a savage. They said I had blood on my hands. He broke the stick in his hands. I learned that the truth does not care what people say. Mara, the truth is what you carry in your chest. Sterling can call your grief a costume, but he cannot take the love you had for your husband, and he cannot take the justice we are going to bring down on his head. Mara looked at him. She saw the scars on his soul that matched the scars on his skin. He wasn't trying to fix her pain. He was showing her his own, so she wouldn't have to carry hers alone. She stepped away from the tree. She took a breath of the freezing air. It hurt, but it cleared her head. We have work to do, she said. They made camp that night 5 miles out of town, in a dense thicket of spruce that blocked the wind. They risked a small fire, kept deep in a pit to hide the light. The intimacy between them was growing in the quiet moments. It wasn't spoken. It was in the way Elias handed her a tin cup of coffee, his fingers brushing hers for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. It was in the way he reached out and used his thumb to wipe a smudge of soot from her cheek, his touch rough but incredibly gentle. Mara found herself leaning toward him when they sat by the fire, seeking his warmth before she remembered herself and pulled back. But each time she pulled back, the distance she retreated was shorter. The next day, the trail turned brutal. They were moving through a narrow pass, the snow thigh-deep in places, the trees pressed in close, a claustrophobic tunnel of black timber and white drifts. Mara was in the lead, breaking trail. Elias was 10 paces behind, covering the rear. The ambush did not start with a shout. It started with the crack of a branch that wasn't a branch. A rifle shot shattered the silence. Snow exploded from the bark of a pine tree inches from Mara's face. She didn't think. She didn't gasp. She dropped. She hit the snow and rolled, her body moving on a script written years ago in the blood of the Dakotas. She scrambled behind a granite boulder, her Winchester already coming off her shoulder. "Left flank!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the ringing in her ears. He was down, firing his pistol toward a cluster of rocks on the ridge. 2 more shots kicked up snow near her boots. They were pinned. Mara pulled her glove off with her teeth. She needed to feel the trigger. She pressed her cheek against the freezing wood of the stock. She breathed in. She breathed out. She saw a flash of movement in the trees. A coat sleeve, brown canvas against the snow. Distance 80 yards. Wind, negligible. Elevation, slightly above. She didn't aim for the head. Killing was easy, but killing took a piece of you that you never got back. She shifted her aim 6 inches down and 4 inches to the right. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked. A man screamed, a high, thin sound that echoed off the canyon walls. The brown coat spun and fell, clutching a shattered shoulder. "One down," she whispered. Another shooter broke cover, trying to run for a better angle. He was fast, moving between the trees. Mara tracked him. She led him by a foot. She fired. The bullet took him in the thigh. He went down like a puppet with cut strings, thrashing in the snow. "Pull back," a voice yelled from the ridge. "She is picking us apart." Silence returned as quickly as it had left. The remaining attackers, 2 or 3, by the sound of the retreating horses, fled. They had expected a frightened woman. They had found the snipe. Mara stayed behind the rock for a full minute, her rifle trained on the empty woods. Only when Elias whistled 3 long notes did she lower the weapon. She stood up. The world tilted. She stumbled to the nearest tree, doubled over, and retched. Nothing came up but bile and coffee, but her body was convulsing, trying to expel the violence she had just committed. It wasn't fear of death. It was the horror of competence. It was the memory of the bell tower, of the bodies in the snow, of the person she had become to survive. "Mara!" Elias was there. He didn't touch her rifle. He put his hands on her shoulders, gripping hard. "Breathe," he commanded softly. "Deeply? In through the nose," she gasped, her breath hitching. "I didn't want to." "You defended us," Elias said. "You aimed for the limbs. You showed them mercy they did not earn. Look at me." She looked up. Her eyes were wild, the pupils blown wide. "You are not a monster," he said. "You are a protector. There is a difference." She gripped the lapels of his coat, burying her face in the rough wool. He smelled of gunpowder and sweat, a smell that should have been terrifying but was the only solid thing in a spinning world. He held her, his hand cupping the back of her head, until the shaking stopped. They pushed on until dusk, needing to put miles between them and the ambush site. They reached a remote way station, a crude log structure that served as a stop for mail carriers and trappers. The owner, a man named Higgins with a face like a dried apple, looked them over with suspicion. He saw the mud on Mara's hem, the bandage on Elias's leg, the exhausted, hunted look in their eyes. "No rooms?" Higgins grunted, blocking the doorway. "Full up." The common room behind him was empty, save for a sleeping dog. "We don't need a room," Elias said, his voice raspy. Just a corner of the stable, and grain for the horses if we had them. But we don't. We will pay for the space. Don't want trouble, Higgins said, eyeing Elias's dark skin. You look like trouble. Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out his last $2 silver, money he had been saving for the train. Double the rate, Elias said, and I will split that cord of wood you have sitting out back before we leave in the morning. Higgins looked at the silver. Greed won out over prejudice. He snatched the coins. Stable is round back. Don't smoke in the straw. If you burn it down, I will hang you. The stable was cold, but it was out of the wind. They found a stall filled with fresh hay and collapsed into it. They didn't light a lantern. They sat in the dark, listening to the horses chew and stomp. Mara leaned her head back against the stall partition. I'm tired. Elias, I know, he said from the darkness beside her. Not just tired of walking, she said. I am tired of being the thing people tell stories about. The Black Widow, the Snipe. I just want to be human. I want to be someone who plants seeds and watches them grow, not someone who buries things. Elias moved. He shifted in the straw until he was sitting next to her. He took her hand. His skin was rough, calloused, warm. I have been alone for 10 years, he said quietly, walking from town to town, tracking men I don't know, for people who don't care if I live or die. I told myself it was freedom. But it wasn't. It was just a long way of saying I didn't matter to anyone. He squeezed her hand. You matter. Mara. She turned her head. In the faint light coming through the slats of the stable wall, she could see the outline of his face, the sharp cheekbones, the scar on his chin, the eyes that watched her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Elias, she whispered. He leaned in. It wasn't like the kiss in the cabin, born of adrenaline and panic. This was slow, deliberate. His lips brushed hers. A question. She answered by reaching up and threading her fingers into his hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, a surrender to the gravity that had been pulling them together since the first night. It was a shedding of armor. For a moment, she wasn't the widow, and he wasn't the drifter. They were just two warm bodies in a cold world, finding a harbor. There was a softness in it that broke her heart. It was the relief of being wanted, not for her land, not for her papers, not for her body as a conquest, but for herself. They did not go further. The stable was freezing, and the danger was too close. But they lay down together in the hay, wrapped in their coats and blankets, limbs tangled together. Mara fell asleep with her head on his chest, listening to his heart beat a steady rhythm against her ear. Morning brought the gray light of reality, and with it, a sharp, terrifying vulnerability. Mara woke first. She looked at Elias sleeping beside her, his face unguarded in rest. A wave of panic washed over her. Attachment was dangerous. Loving Jacob had almost destroyed her when he died. If she let herself love this man, this broken, beautiful, dangerous man, the loss would kill her. She knew it. And Elias, waking moments later, felt the same icy grip of fear. He looked at her and thought of the bullets hitting the snow yesterday. He was dragging her into his war. He was the reason she was sleeping in a stable instead of her cabin. If she died because of him. They pulled apart, the distance between them sudden and awkward. They brushed the straw from their clothes in silence, avoiding eye contact. They walked out of the stable to find the world waiting for them. Pinned to the stable door with a hunting knife was a woman's shawl. It was gray wool, knitted with a distinctive pattern of doves. Mara stopped, the blood draining from her face. She reached out and touched the wool. "Martha?" she whispered. "It is Martha Gable's shawl." There was a note attached. The handwriting was elegant, educated. Sterling's hand. "We have the midwife. She is old and frail. The cold is hard on old bones. Bring the papers to the devil's throat cut at dusk. Come alone, or she freezes." Mara gripped the shawl, crushing the wool in her fist. A sound tore out of her throat, half sob, half snarl. "They took her," she said. "Because I didn't give them what they wanted." She turned to Elias, her eyes hard and bright. "I am going," she said. "I am taking the papers, and I am going." "We are going," Elias corrected. No, Mara shouted. Read the note. Come alone. If they see you, they will kill her. This is my debt. Elias, Martha is innocent. I will not let her die for my land. It is not about the land anymore, Elias said, his voice calm but immovable. It is about the papers. Once you hand them over, you are loose ends. They will kill you both and throw you down the mine shaft. You know this. I have to try. We will try, Elias said, but we do it my way. We do it as partners. I can't lose you too, she whispered, the truth slipping out. Elias stepped close. He took her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. You won't, he said, because we are not going to play by their rules. They want a widow to walk into a trap. They are getting the Snipe and the Scout. He released her and pulled his pistol, checking the cylinder. He had 6 shots left. Mara had 10 rounds for the rifle. The Devil's Throat is a box canyon, Elias said, his mind shifting into tactical gear. High walls, 1 entrance. They will have shooters on the rim, but the sun sets behind the western ridge. At dusk, the bottom of the cut will be in shadow, but the rim will be silhouetted against the sky. We have the advantage of the light, Mara said, catching his thought. If we move fast, Elias said, and if we are willing to bleed, he held out his hand. Together, Mara looked at his hand. She looked at the shawl. She looked at the mountains looming in the distance, indifferent and cruel. She took his hand. Together, she vowed. They gathered their meager gear. They checked their weapons one last time, and then, side by side, the woman in black and the man with the scar stepped into the dark timber, walking toward the dusk. The Devil's Throat was not a place where living things went by choice. It was a jagged gash in the earth where the mountain had been blasted open 20 years prior, a failed vein of silver that had yielded nothing but gray rock and bankruptcy. The wind here did not just blow. It screamed through the rotting timber supports of the old mine entrance, a hollow, mournful sound that drowned out the crunch of boots on snow. Mara Vance lay on her stomach on a ridge of slate overlooking the cut. The cold was a physical weight, pressing her into the stone. She did not feel it. Her world had narrowed to the iron sights of her Winchester and the scene playing out 50 yards below. The sun was setting behind the western peaks, casting the bottom of the cut into deep, purple shadow, while the rim where she lay was still touched by the fading light. Elias had been right. The contrast made the men below look like ghosts, while any movement on the ridge would be stark black against the twilight sky. But Mara knew this ground. She knew that the wind swirled in a vortex near the mine entrance. She knew that the pile of tailings to the left offered false cover because it shifted under weight. She had placed a small cairn of stones near the dead spruce sapling earlier, a marker for range. Elias was down there. He had insisted on walking in alone to make the exchange. While she held the high ground, it was a risk that made her bile rise. But it was the only way. Below, Silas Vane waited. He sat on a large rock, looking comfortable despite the freezing temperature. Behind him stood Caleb and Dutch, their coats open to reveal pistol belts, and between them, kneeling in the snow, was Martha Gable. The older woman looked small and broken. Her gray hair had come loose from its pins, whipping around her face. She was shivering violently, her hands bound behind her back. Elias walked into the clearing. He held his hands out, showing he was empty-handed, though his coat was bulky over his hips. "You brought the papers," Vane called out. His voice was smooth, carrying easily over the wind. "I brought copies," Elias said. He stopped 10 paces away. "The originals are with a federal marshal in Silverton. If we do not report in by noon tomorrow, he opens the file." Vane laughed. It was a dry, rattling sound. "You are bluffing, Tracker. You haven't had time to make Silverton. You are tired, you are hurt, and you are trying to play poker with a man holding 4 aces." He stood up and walked over to Martha. He placed a hand on her shoulder. Martha flinched, a spasm of terror that Mara saw clearly through the sights. "Where is the widow?" Vane asked, scanning the ridge. "Too cowardly to face her betters? I suppose that fits. She always was a skulking thing, a black widow hiding in her web." "She is watching you," Elias said. And she is listening. Is she? Vane shouted to the rocks. Can you hear me? Mara, I hope you can see what your stubbornness has bought. You want to play the victim? You want to pretend you are grieving? We know the truth. You are just a woman who doesn't know when to sign her name. Let the woman go. Vane, Elias said, his voice hardening. This is between you and the deed. No, Vane said softly. This is between me and the man who pays me, and Councilman Sterling does not like loose ends. Elias took a step forward. Sterling is a thief. These deeds are forged. You are killing people for a lie. Vane, you are hanging women to cover up a land grab. It is progress, Vane sneered. The railroad is coming. Progress requires sacrifice. Jacob Vance didn't understand that. He thought a piece of paper and a handshake meant something. Vane leaned in, his voice dropping, but in the acoustic bowl of the mine-cut, the words drifted up to Mara like poisonous smoke. Do you want to know the truth, boy? Jacob didn't slip. He didn't fall down a ravine. I met him on the trail that morning. I told him the councilman was making a final offer. Jacob laughed. He said this land was his blood. Mara's finger tightened on the trigger. Her breath caught in her throat. So I broke his legs, Vane said conversationally. And then I dragged him to the edge. He was crying at the end, calling for her. Mara, Mara. It was pathetic. And the best part? The town believed she did it. They wanted to believe it. It is easier to blame a witch than to catch a wolf. The rage hit Mara like a lightning strike. It wasn't the hot, blinding anger of the ambush. It was cold. It was absolute. It was the clarity of ice. For 3 years, she had carried the shame of his death. She had wondered, in her darkest nights, if she had somehow failed him, if her bad luck had cursed him. But it wasn't bad luck. It was murder. She shifted her aim. She didn't aim for Vane. She aimed for the rock face directly behind Dutch, the heavy-set man holding Martha's rope. Wind, full value left to right. Range, 60 yards. Angle, steep depression. You are lying, Elias said, but his hand was drifting toward his coat. Am I? Vane drew his revolver. It doesn't matter. History is written by the men standing up, and you, my friend, are about to sit down. Vane raised the gun toward Elias. Drop! Mara screamed. Her voice tore through the canyon, a raw sound of fury and command. Elias didn't hesitate. He threw himself flat into the snow just as Vane fired. The bullet snapped through the air where his chest had been. Mara squeezed the trigger. Crack! The bullet slammed into the granite inches from Dutch's head. Rock fragments sprayed into his face. He yelled, clapping his hands to his eyes. Dropping the rope. Snipe! Caleb screamed. On the ridge! The canyon exploded into chaos. Elias rolled, coming up on one knee, his colt barking. He wasn't firing wildly. He was firing to suppress, driving Vane and Caleb back behind the tailings pile. Mara worked the lever of the Winchester. Click-clack. She saw Dutch stumbling blindly, reaching for his shotgun. She didn't let him find it. She put a round through his right thigh. He went down hard, screaming. Get Martha! Mara shouted. Elias was already moving. He scrambled across the open ground, slipping on the icy scree. Bullets kicked up snow around his boots. Vane was firing from behind the rock, his shots disciplined and deadly. Mara tracked Vane's position. She couldn't see him, but she could see the puff of smoke every time he fired. She fired at the edge of the rock, chipping the stone, forcing him to keep his head down. Covering! She yelled. Elias reached Martha. He grabbed her arm, hauling her up. She was dead weight, her legs frozen, her mind shut down by terror. Move, Mrs. Gable! Elias roared, dragging her toward the shelter of a rusted ore cart. A shot rang out from the tree line above the cut. Mara heard the zip of the bullet passing her ear before she heard the report. A fourth man. Vane had a shooter in the trees. She rolled onto her back, sliding down the far side of the slate ridge just as a second bullet shattered the stone where she had been lying. She was exposed. She had lost the high ground. She scrambled into the timber. Moving low and fast, she needed a new angle. She circled left, her breath burning her lungs. She moved by instinct, reading the terrain, the dip in the ground, the thick trunk of a ponderosa pine. She came out on a flank, 40 yards from the tree-line shooter. He was focused on her old position. She braced against the pine. She exhaled. She squeezed. The shot took him in the shoulder. He fell from his perch, crashing through the branches. Below, the fight was turning into a brawl. Elias was pinned behind the ore cart with Martha. Vane and Caleb were advancing, using the suppression from the now silent tree shooter to move up. "Give it up, Thorne!" Vane shouted. "You have nowhere to go. We have the deputy on the road. You are boxed in." Elias popped up, firing 2 shots. One hit Caleb in the arm, spinning him around. Caleb dropped his gun, clutching the wound, and scrambled back into the dark. Only Vane remained, but Vane was dangerous. He didn't panic. He moved methodically, closing the distance to the ore cart. Mara slid down the scree slope, risking a twisted ankle to get back to the fight. She hit the bottom of the cut, her boots skidding on the ice. She saw Vane. He was 10 yards from Elias. He had a clear line of sight to the side of the ore cart where Elias was exposed. "Elias!" she screamed. Vane turned. He saw her, the woman in black standing in the open, the wind whipping her dress around her legs, the rifle in her hands. For a second, they looked at each other, the murderer and the widow. Mara raised the rifle. She had the shot, center mass, a kill shot. It would end it. It would end the fear, the threat, the nightmares. But she hesitated. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of the soul. Killing a man in the heat of battle was one thing. Executing a man who was looking you in the eye was another. It was the line between a soldier and a murderer. And in that split second, Mara Vance flinched from crossing it. Vane saw the hesitation. He grinned. He didn't fire at her. He spun back toward the ore cart and fired at Elias. The bullet caught Elias in the side. The impact threw him backward into the snow. He groaned, clutching his ribs, his pistol falling from his hand. "No!" Mara shrieked. The hesitation vanished. The moral weight evaporated, replaced by cold, desperate survival. She had hesitated, and Elias had paid for it. Vane turned back to her, raising his gun for the finishing shot. Mara didn't think. She didn't aim. She became the weapon. She fired from the hip. The bullet struck Vane in the right knee. It shattered the joint. Vane screamed, his leg buckling under him. He collapsed into the snow, his gun flying wide. He tried to rise, but the leg was useless, a ruin of bone and gristle. Mara cycled the lever. She walked toward him. She didn't run. She walked with the slow, terrifying inevitability of judgment. Vane looked up at her, his face gray with shock. He saw the muzzle of the Winchester pointed at his chest. "Don't," he gasped. "I can cut a deal. Sterling, I can give you sterling." Mara looked down at him. She looked at Elias, who was trying to push himself up, blood dark on his coat. She looked at Martha, who was sobbing quietly against the rusted metal wheels. "I do not want a deal," Mara said, her voice trembling with the adrenaline crash. "I want you to live. I want you to live a long time with a leg that will never carry you again. I want you to remember that a widow put you in the dirt." She kicked his pistol away. Elias coughed, a wet, hacking sound. Mara abandoned Vane and ran to him. "Elias," she cried, dropping to her knees. "Let me see." "It is the ribs," Elias rasped, his teeth gritted. "Armor of the coat. Slowed it, but it stings." She checked the wound. The bullet had hit the thick leather of his ammo belt and deflected into the flesh of his side. It was bleeding heavily, but it hadn't punctured the lung. "We have to go," Elias said, gripping her arm. "Vane said the deputy is on the road. The shots. They will bring everyone." "Martha," Mara said. "We have to get Martha." They grabbed the older woman. Martha was in shock, unable to walk. "I can't," Martha wept. "Leave me. I am just an old woman." "We leave no one," Mara said fiercely. She handed her rifle to Elias, who used it as a crutch. Mara bent down and, with a grunt of effort, pulled Martha's arm over her shoulder. Elias took the other side. They hobbled out of the Devil's Throat, leaving the groaning men in the bloody snow. They didn't go back to the road. They went straight into the black timber, pushing through the deep drifts, heading for the only place Mara knew they wouldn't be followed immediately. The hollow. Night fell with the weight of a coffin lid. The temperature dropped to 30 below. The woods were a labyrinth of shadows and cracking branches. They made it 2 miles before Martha collapsed. They found a depression under the low-hanging boughs of a massive spruce tree, a snow cave created by the weight of the branches touching the ground. It was dry inside, sheltered from the wind, carpeted with needles. They crawled in. It was tight, dark, and smelled of resin and old earth. Mara worked by feel. She had no lantern. She struck a match, shielding the tiny flame with her body to check the wounds. Martha was frostbitten but whole. Elias was worse. The graze on his side was deep, and he had lost blood. He was shivering violently, the hypothermia creeping in to finish what Vane had started. "We need heat," Mara whispered. "But a fire will be seen." "Body heat," Elias chattered. "It is. The only way." They huddled together in a pile of misery and survival. Mara placed Martha in the middle, wrapping the older woman in the best blanket. She and Elias pressed in on either side, sharing their warmth. Mara tore a strip from her petticoat and bound Elias's ribs tight. Her hands were slick with his blood, shaking so hard she could barely tie the knot. "I hesitated," she whispered into the dark. Her voice broke. "I had him, Elias. I had a clean shot, and I didn't take it. And he shot you." Elias reached out in the darkness. His hand found her face. His fingers were ice cold, but his touch was steady. "You hesitated because you are human," he whispered. "Because you are not him." "I almost got you killed," she sobbed quietly. "I am not a soldier. I am just a woman who brings bad luck." "Mara," he said sharply. "Stop." He pulled her face down to his. "You saved us," he said. "You walked into hell and you dragged us out. You are the bravest thing I have ever seen." "I'm afraid," she admitted. "I am so afraid." "Good," he said. "Fear keeps you warm." He kissed her then. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't romantic in the way of storybooks. It was fierce. It was desperate. It was a collision of teeth and cold lips and the metallic taste of blood. It was a kiss that tried to steal the breath from the other person because their own breath wasn't enough. Mara clung to him. She gripped his coat, burying her fingers in the wool. She kissed him back with a hunger that terrified her. She wanted to crawl inside his skin, to hide in his strength, to prove to herself that he was still warm, still alive. They clung to each other in the snow dark, listening to Martha's shallow breathing and the wind howling outside their fragile shelter. "I love you," Elias whispered against her mouth. The words were a shock, a sudden, bright flare in the darkness. Mara froze. She had buried her heart with Jacob. She had thought there was nothing left to give, but as she held this damaged, stubborn man who had bled for her, she realized the trunk wasn't the only thing she had unlocked. "I love you," she whispered back. It felt like a vow. It felt like loading a weapon. Morning came with a deceptive peace. The wind died. The sun rose on a world of glittering white diamond, but the peace was a lie. Elias woke first. He was stiff, in agony, but the fever had broken. He crawled to the edge of the spruce boughs and peered out. He saw the smoke rising from the town in the distance, and he heard the bells. The church bells of Clearwater were ringing, not the slow toll of a funeral, but the frantic, clanging rhythm of an alarm. "Mara," he said, shaking her shoulder. "Wake up!" She sat up, gasping, her hand instantly going to the knife in her boot. "What is it?" "The town," Elias said grimly. "They are signaling." They crawled out of the shelter. The air was crisp, freezing. From their vantage point on the slope, they could see the road leading out of Clearwater. A column of riders was moving out, 20 men, armed. "A posse," Mara said, her voice dull. "Sterling." Elias nodded. "Miller must have made it back. They know Vane failed. They know we have the papers. Sterling is throwing everything he has at us. He is calling it bringing order." "They will track us," Mara said. "In this snow." We leave a highway behind us. We can't outrun them carrying Martha, Elias said. And we can't fight 20 men. Mara looked at the riders. She looked at the papers tucked inside her dress. She looked at Elias, battered and bleeding, and Martha, who was barely conscious. She realized then that the woods could no longer save her. The shadows were full. The isolation that had been her shield was now her prison. There was only one way to end this. "We don't run," Mara said. Elias looked at her. "Mara? We don't run away," she said, her voice gaining strength. "We run to them." "What?" "We go to the one place Sterling doesn't think we will go," she said. "We go to the center of town. We go to the church. We ring the bell until every soul in Clearwater is standing in the square, and we read the papers out loud. That is suicide," Elias said. "Sterling will shoot us before we get a word out." "Maybe," Mara said. She touched the scar on her shoulder. She touched the grip of her Winchester. "But I am done hiding in the dark. Elias, if we are going to die, let us die in the light. Let them see exactly who they are killing." She turned to him, her eyes clear and dry. "Are you with me?" Elias looked at the posse riding toward the mountains. He looked at the woman who had shot the knee out of a killer to save his life. He smiled, a crooked, painful, beautiful smile. "Lead the way. Snipe." The dawn broke over the Sawtooth Ridge not with hope, but with a cold, indifferent clarity. The sun was a pale disk behind a veil of ice crystals, casting long, blue shadows across the snow. Ravens circled in the updrafts, silent black specks waiting for the world below to yield something dead. Mara Vance walked into Clearwater. She did not skulk in the alleys, and she did not run. She walked down the center of the main street, her boots breaking the crust of the ruts with a steady, rhythmic crunch. To her right limped Elias Thorne, using her Winchester as a crutch, his face gray with pain but his eyes scanning the rooftops. Between them, supported by their interlocked arms, was Martha Gable. The town was waking up. Shopkeepers sweeping boardwalks stopped mid-stroke. A mule driver hauled on his reins, staring. They looked at the trio like they were seeing ghosts rise from the grave. The Black Widow, the Drifter, and the schoolteacher, battered, blood-stained, and walking with the grim purpose of an execution squad. They did not stop at the sheriff's office. They walked past the saloon and the general store, straight to the brick courthouse where the circuit judge, Honorable Thaddeus Halloway, had arrived late last night on the mail coach. The doors were heavy oak. Elias pushed one open. Inside, the courtroom, which doubled as the town meeting hall, was already buzzing. A land dispute between two cattlemen was on the docket. Judge Halloway sat behind a high desk, looking bored and tired. A man who had seen too much frontier foolishness and not enough law. When Mara entered, the room went silent. It was a physical silence, heavy and suffocating. "Order," Judge Halloway muttered, banging his gavel without looking up. "Next case. We are the next case," Mara said. Her voice was raspy from smoke and cold, but it carried to the back of the room. Halloway looked up. He adjusted his spectacles. He saw the woman in the torn black dress, the soot on her cheek, the armed man beside her. "This is a court of law, madam," Halloway rumbled. "Not a hospital ward. Who are you?" "I am Mara Vance," she said, "and I am here to report a murder." An hour later, the courtroom was packed. Word had spread through Clearwater faster than fire in dry grass. The posse that Sterling had sent out was still in the woods chasing shadows, leaving the councilman exposed. Sterling sat in the front row, his face a mask of polite concern that was slowly cracking around the edges. Deputy Miller stood by the door, his hand resting nervously on his gun belt. Elias stood before the bench. He had refused a chair. He looked like a wolf that had been chewed up by a bear, but was still standing out of spite. "We have heard a great deal of fantastical stories," Judge Halloway said, leaning back. "You claim that a respected town councilman hired thugs to harass a widow, burn property, and kidnap a woman of good standing, and you claim this was done to cover up a fraudulent land scheme. That is a heavy accusation. Mr. Thorn, especially coming from a man with your history. My history is not on trial, Elias said evenly. The facts are, the Consolidated Rail Company is not buying land in this valley. Councilman Sterling is buying it under a shell company, forging the deeds and planning to sell it to the railroad at a 400% markup when the spur comes through next spring. Speculation, Sterling called out from his seat. He stood up, smoothing his waistcoat. Your Honor, this man is a vagrant, a known agitator. He seduced this poor, grieving woman into a violent fantasy. Look at her. She is hysterical. Holloway looked at Mara. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in her lap. She was not hysterical. She was terrifyingly still. Mrs. Vance, Holloway said, do you have anything to offer besides the word of this man? Mara stood up. The psychological wall she had built for 3 years stood before her. To speak was to let them in. To speak was to admit that she had been hunted, that she had been afraid, that she was not the witch they whispered about, but something far more dangerous. She looked at the faces in the crowd. She saw the shopkeeper who had shortchanged her. She saw the women who had crossed the street to avoid her shadow. I have my husband's letter, she said. She pulled the packet from her bodice. She walked to the bench and placed it on the wood. Jacob wrote this the night before he died, Mara said. He details the threats. He details the offer Sterling made, $100 for a claim worth $10,000, and he names the men Sterling sent to convince him. Silas Vane, Caleb, Dutch. Holloway picked up the letter. He read it in silence. The room held its breath. This is a forgery, Sterling snapped, his voice rising an octave. The woman is desperate. She has been living alone in the woods too long. Everyone knows she is unstable. They call her the Black Widow for a reason. Judge, she brings death to men. I do not bring death, Mara said, turning to face him. I survive it. Sterling sneered. Is that so? We heard reports of a gunfight in the mountains. Men wounded. Are we to believe you did that? A woman? No. This drifter did the killing. And you are covering for him because he warms your bed. The insult landed like a slap. A ripple of titters ran through the crowd. It was the old weapon. Shame. If they could paint her as immoral, as unnatural, then her truth didn't matter. Mara looked at Elias. He was watching her, his eyes steady, giving her his strength without taking her voice. She looked back at Sterling. I shot Silas Vane, she said clearly. The room gasped. I shot him in the knee at a range of 30 yards, she continued. I shot the man in the tree line at 100 yards, and I shot the rope from Mrs. Gable's hands at 60 yards. Lies, Sterling laughed. You're a gardener, Mrs. Vance. My name, she said, her voice dropping to a register of cold steel, was Mara Cole before I married. I scouted for the Army in the Dakotas during the Sioux uprisings. The soldiers there called me the Snipe. The silence that followed was absolute. The name was a legend, a campfire story about a ghost who never missed. To see that ghost standing in a torn morning dress in a small-town courtroom was shattering. I killed to protect this town, Mara said. I killed to protect my home. And I killed because you, Councilman Sterling, paid men to murder my husband and bury the truth under a pile of forged papers. She pointed a finger at him. It did not tremble. You called me a widow to isolate me. You called me a witch to discredit me. But I am neither. I am a witness. And I am done hiding. Judge Holloway looked at the letter again. He looked at the map Elias had placed beside it, the original survey with the red ink. Marshal, Holloway said to the court bailiff, arrest Councilman Sterling and send a deputy to the Devil's Throat to retrieve the men Mrs. Vance claims are waiting there. You cannot do this, Sterling shouted, his face turning purple. I am the council. This is my town. Not anymore, Holloway said. Sterling's eyes darted around the room. He saw the bailiff moving toward him. He saw the ruin of his empire. He looked at Deputy Miller by the door. He nodded. It happened fast. Violence in the West always did. A sudden explosion after a long fuse. Miller drew his gun. Nobody moves, he screamed. At the same moment, the back door of the courtroom burst open. 2 men, the remnants of Vane's gang who had escaped the ambush, rushed in. Bandanas over their faces, shotguns leveled. "Get the papers!" one shouted. The crowd screamed. People dove under benches. The bailiff froze, his hands in the air. Miller grabbed Sterling, using the confusion to shove the councilman toward the side exit. "Elias!" Mara shouted. Elias was already moving. He shoved the plaintiff's table over, creating a barricade. A shotgun blast tore into the wood, sending splinters flying. "Go!" Elias yelled at her. "Get out!" "No!" Elias popped up, firing his pistol. He hit one of the masked men in the shoulder, but the other returned fire, the buckshot hammering the wall inches from Judge Holloway's head. The courtroom was a kill box. Smoke filled the air instantly. Mara scrambled across the floor. She saw her rifle leaning against the judge's bench where the bailiff had placed it as evidence. She grabbed it. It was empty. "Elias, ammo!" Elias reached into his pocket and threw her a handful of cartridges. They scattered on the floor. Mara snatched them up, her fingers flying as she loaded the magazine. 1, 2, 3. Miller and Sterling were at the side door. Miller turned, raising his pistol toward the overturned table where Elias was pinned. Mara stood up. She didn't have cover. She stood in the center of the courtroom. Amidst the screaming townsfolk and the swirling smoke, she cycled the lever. She saw Miller's gun leveling at Elias's exposed back. She saw Sterling opening the door to freedom. She had a choice. She could shoot Sterling. She could kill the man who murdered her husband, the man who had ruined her life. It would be justice. It would be vengeance. But Miller was going to kill Elias. Mara shifted her aim. She ignored Sterling. She ignored the rage screaming in her blood. She focused on the deputy's hand. Distance, 20 feet, target, moving, crack. The bullet struck Miller's revolver, smashing the steel into his hand. Miller shrieked, clutching his mangled fingers, dropping to his knees. Sterling froze in the doorway, staring at Mara. He waited for the second shot. He waited to die. Mara racked the lever again. She held the rifle on him. Her eyes were voids. "Walk," she said. "Walk to the bench." Sterling looked at the gun. He looked at the woman holding it. He slumped, the fight draining out of him like water from a cracked jar. He raised his hands and walked back into the room. The remaining gunman, seeing his paymasters broken, dropped his shotgun and ran out the back door. Silence returned to the courtroom, ringing in the ears of the survivors. Judge Holloway slowly stood up from behind his bench. He looked at the bullet hole in the wall. He looked at Mara, who was still standing like a statue, the rifle trained on Sterling. "Bailiff," Holloway said, his voice shaking slightly. "Secure the prisoner." Elias stood up from behind the table. He was bleeding again from his side, but he walked to Mara. He didn't take the gun from her. He simply placed his hand on the barrel, gently pushing it down until it pointed at the floor. "It is over, Mara," he whispered. "It is done." Mara let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 3 years. She slumped against him, and he caught her, holding her up before the eyes of the entire town. Justice in the territories was rarely swift and never perfect, but it was real. Councilman Sterling was denied bail. The federal marshal arrived from Silverton 2 days later, taking custody of both Sterling and the surviving members of the gang. The investigation into the land deeds was brutal and thorough. 26 claims were frozen, and the railroad company, eager to avoid a scandal, disavowed Sterling and negotiated fair prices with the original owners. For Mara, the victory was quieter. She sat on the steps of the courthouse 3 days later. The sun was actually warm on her face. The snow was beginning to melt, turning the streets to mud. A lawyer from Denver had just handed her a document. Her title was clear. The mortgage was dissolved, paid by the seizure of Sterling's assets. She was free, but freedom felt heavy. Elias came out of the general store across the street. He was walking with a cane now, his legs stiff but healing. He carried a small sack of supplies. He sat down beside her on the steps. He didn't speak for a long time. They watched the town go about its business. People still stared, but the looks were different now. There was fear, yes, but there was also respect. No one whispered "Black Widow" anymore. They tipped their hats and gave her a wide berth, acknowledging her as a force of nature. "The marshal says I have to stay in the territory for the trial," Elias said. "Could be months." "I heard," Mara said. "I have been thinking," Elias said. He traced a pattern in the mud with his cane. "I have no home to go back to, and you have a roof that needs fixing." Mara looked at him. She saw the gray in his stubble, the lines of pain around his eyes, the way he looked at her not as a legend or a victim, but as an equal. "The roof leaks in the thaw," she said, "and the wood pile is low." "I can chop wood," Elias said, "and I am fair at carpentry. It is a hard life." "Elias," she warned, "the winters are long. The wolves come close, and the town, they will never truly accept us. We will always be the shooter and the tracker." "I am tired of towns," Elias said, "and I am tired of being accepted by people I do not respect." He turned to look at her fully. "I am not looking for a savior, Mara, and I am not looking to be one. I am looking for a partner, someone who knows how to hold the line when the storm comes." Mara felt the tears prick her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away this time. "I have a trunk," she said softly. "It is empty now. I was thinking of filling it with new things. Seeds, books, maybe a new quilt." "Sounds like a good start," Elias said. He reached out and took her hand. His grip was warm, solid, permanent. "Let's go home," he said. They returned to the high country a week later. The snow was receding, revealing the black earth and the resilient green of pine needles. The cabin was as they had left it, though the scars of the siege were visible, the bullet holes in the logs, the charred remains of the shed. It looked wounded, but standing. They spent the first day in silence, working. Elias patched the roof. Mara scrubbed the floor, washing away the memory of the siege. They moved with a domestic rhythm that felt strange and miraculous. That evening, they stood at the edge of the tree line. The sun was setting, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and gold. The mountains loomed above them, indifferent, brutal, and beautiful. Mara leaned against Elias. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. She didn't brace herself. She let her weight rest on him. She thought of Jacob, and the grief washed over her, a familiar tide, but it didn't drown her. It was just water, cold and clean. She realized she could love the dead without dying with them. She realized she could love the living without betraying the past. Elias kissed the top of her head. "The ground is soft enough to dig," he said. "We can plant the garden soon." "Potatoes," Mara said, "and carrots, and maybe some flowers, by the porch." "Flowers would be nice," Elias agreed. They stood there as the stars came out, hard and bright points of light in the vast darkness. They were two scarred people on the edge of the world, holding on to each other against the cold. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The world was still hard. The gun was still loaded by the door, but as the wind came down from the peaks, it didn't sound like judgment anymore. It just sounded like the wind. And for the first time in 3 years, Mara Vance was not waiting for the end. She was waiting for the morning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I hope the journey of Mara and Elias resonated with you. I would love to know where you are listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of the American frontier, please consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories of survival, love, and justice under the open sky. I also invite you to share your thoughts on the story in English in the comments section. Did Mara make the right choice? What would you have done in her boots? I look forward to reading your insights. Until the next time, keep your powder dry.